It's ad break time. I'm proud to announce that the Beyond Solitaire podcast is sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations. At this very moment, Greg Loring Albright's Keep the Faith is crowdfunding on BackerKit. It's a light RPG about the evolution of a new religion, and I'm working on the curriculum guide for it, so you already know I think it's great, so keep an eye out for it. I will also mention that if you want to support this podcast, please visit patreon.com/beyondsolitaire and help me keep the lights on. But for now, let's get on with the show. Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and this week on the pod I have a very special guest. This is Dr. Emily Knox. She's a professor in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And we are talking about something very different today because normally this is a board game podcast, but I have invited Emily on to talk about book banning in 21st century America, which is a book that she had previously published, is now revising in the middle of the political climate we're in. So, how you doing, Emily?
I'm okay. How are you?
Oh, I think okay is probably about as good as it gets right now. But I guess I want to start with tell us about your book. Why was book banning the topic that drew you to write about an academic register?
Yeah, so my mom was a high school librarian, and we always observed Banned Books Week. I went to grad school a lot, and I also got my degree in library information science and worked as a theological librarian for 5 years. But when I decided to get my doctorate, I knew I wanted to study people. Why do people ban books? So that's always been of interest to me. And this book actually just came out of my dissertation, and I recently have been working on the second edition of it.
Excellent. So one thing I thought was particularly interesting about your approach is that, I mean, obviously you are a librarian. Your mom was also, in libraries, and so, you made an effort to really talk to and listen to people who were banning books, which is something that I'm assuming you do not personally support. So, I guess I kind of want to start there. Like, what were you hoping that your book would do, and how did you get yourself to a place where you could gather the information it took to write it?
So what I was trying to think about was what are the rational reasons for trying to ban books? Like what is the point? First of all, it's something that doesn't make a lot of sense if you think about it. There are lots of ways to get books. So, like, saying your book can't be in a school or library is kind of weird, right? Because, like, you can get the book other places. You can get it illegally. Like, there's just all sorts of ways to get a book. So, what's the point of saying you can't read this book? Also, reading is really important to me. And so I tried to think about it. Well, if reading is important to me, it must be important to other people. And so, why is reading important in our society, and how do we think about it? So, I kind of pulled in all these other ideas. I was a religious studies major in undergrad and grad school the first time. So, I really tried to pull together a lot of different theoretical foundations for thinking about books and reading. And I looked at it from a negative point of view, not a positive point of view. What does it mean to censor books and reading?
That's really interesting. Okay, there's several things I want to come back to from this, but I want to start, I guess, all the way back at the beginning of this answer with, I think a lot of people talk about maybe using the fact that you can get books anywhere to justify banning them in libraries.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, oh, well, if you wanted your kid to read it, you could just go buy it. So we're not really banning anything. But as far as I understand, it is still considered a book ban. So where do librarians at a professional level fall on this, and what does it actually mean to ban a book? I think people have a lot of misconceptions about what it means.
So, the best way to think about book banning is actually to think about restricting access to a book. So when you think about censorship, which is kind of a pejorative word, right? No one wants to be a censor. What I really try to focus on is, have you limited access to this text in some way? And I describe this using what I call the 4 R's. And those R's are redaction, restriction, relocation, and removal. So I can go through those pretty slowly. So redaction is when you mark through something. So you say, like, there's like a bad word in a book, and so you'll Sharpie through it so that people can't read that word, or there's a picture, and so you draw a leaf over the naked person, that kind of thing. That's redaction. Restriction is, you really have to think about who is the intended audience for this particular work. And we are going to say, yes, you're the intended audience, but you can't just get it. Instead, you have to ask someone for it, right? You have to go through this process, or your parents have to fill out a permission slip for you to read it, even though you're the intended audience for the book. Relocation means that, uh, okay, the intended audience is supposed to be, for example, juveniles. It's a chapter book, but we're putting it in the adult section because we don't think it's appropriate for juveniles. Or we're putting it in something called like a parenting section, so that really only adults are supposed to be here. But, we understand this is a picture book, but we want to make sure that, you know, only adults can get at it. Removal is what most people call bans, but it has its own nuances because you have to think about, am I removing it from the public library collection? Am I removing it from the school curriculum? Am I removing it from a summer reading list? Am I removing it from the school library? These all have different levels of restriction, and actually are different requests. Removing something from a curriculum really means, like, I don't think this should be part of the education system. Um, you know, I don't want any child to be required to read this book because I don't think this is good pedagogy, or something like that. Removing something from a public library is more saying, I disagree with this book. I think that, my taxpayers should not go to anybody else being able to read this book. I think it's filth. These are slightly different with those requests. So those are redaction, restriction, relocation, and removal.
Interesting. Okay, so many flavors of book ban. And then I also wanted to ask. I mean, my degrees. One of them is in religious studies as well, and so I wanted to know. So did your past as a theological librarian specifically dovetail with your interest in banned books, or do you? I mean, do you think that having dealt with sensitive material in religious contexts has like given you a particular kind of insight into how this plays out at other levels of library curation?
Yeah, so actually, I'll explain that in a couple different ways. So, my study in religious studies was completely secular. I studied Christianity, and I studied evangelicalism and fundamentalism in America. So that's really where a lot of this comes in. Um, as a theological librarian, I actually worked at the General Theological Seminary of the Episcopal Church. So it was a very left wing institution. I was actually there when Gene Robinson, who was the first gay bishop in the Episcopal Church in the United States, was confirmed as bishop. And one thing that we did was we collected everything about LGBTQIA books and the Episcopal Church. Didn't matter what point of view it was from. Anything that was published went on our shelves. And I realized, like, that was what we were meant to do with our collection development policy, right? Which is to make sure that we had the cultural record for this momentous event that was happening in the history of the church, and not worry about did I agree with what this person was writing? That did not matter, right? Because what matters is that in 50 years, you can go back and see um, why this actually led to a breakup of the Episcopal Church and why it was such a momentous occasion. And Gene Robinson was actually one of our alums, and the people against him were actually our alums also. So it was an interesting time to be there. So my religious studies really comes in when I think about things like the history of Christianity and the idea that we are our understanding of reading is descended from the idea that we're people of the book, and how we think about the fact that reading a book can save your soul. And I talk quite a bit about that in my book, and some of the doctrines that came to us through the Reformation. They've now been secularized, but they still show up in how we talk about the practice of reading.
Yeah, actually, one of my favorite discussions in your book was your discussion of common sense reading and how that influences opinions about books and their appropriateness. So, for people who are not familiar with this, I think that common sense, I guess, theology viewpoints has really impacted the way that we argue about education curriculum and what we read, but also so many people don't really understand what it is. So could you maybe give us just like an overview that kind of leads to why it's so relevant now?
Yeah, so this really comes from Scottish common sense philosophy. So it actually is a full idea that comes into um, philosophy in, I think, the late um, 18th century, and eventually came to the United States. It's actually much more foundational in the United States than it is in other parts of the world. When the Declaration of Independence says we hold these truths to be self evident, this is actually truly a basis in Scottish common sense of philosophy, which is taught at places like Harvard College, to all the guys who signed the Declaration of Independence. Um, what it is in its most basic sense is that things mean what they say and say what they mean. You can get very complicated with the actual Scottish common sense philosophy, which has to do with like moral sentiments and all those things. But the easiest way to think about it is if I read a text and it says that this person used drugs, then it can't mean anything else. Like that's what it means. Uh, you have this idea that there's only one possible interpretation of the text. And in many ways, it's my interpretation because what Scottish common sense philosophy talked about was like we're all moral agents. We have this ability to interpret. And if I read something, then that is what it is. Um, I was actually talking to my students yesterday about the book Genderqueer, which is a graphic memoir. It has some very interesting pictures. And, what people do is they say, look at this picture. This picture has to be pornography. Like, how could it be anything else? Um, Not realizing that other people might look at the picture and be like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Uh, you know, Maya is showing something I haven't seen before. Also, it's a picture of a failed sexual encounter. This is how Maya realized that he is asexual. Like it's got all these other things when I look at it. But when you have a common sense interpretation of text, that becomes impossible. And you can hear it when people say things like, this particular book is harmful, it makes students embarrassed, or like this is often comes up when you talk about things like diverse books or critical race theory, as it's called. Um, Not realizing that other people might have other interpretations of these texts.
Interesting. And then this maybe actually will lead into some of how you got your interviews, but I mean, why is it bad for someone to be embarrassed because of something they read? Like, to me, that seems even more far fetched than being upset, like, oh, it's porn, which is, I think that's very debatable about most books that are in any context where a kid would get a hold of them. But, um, why is embarrassment something that makes a book worthy of being banned?
So I talk about this quite a bit, and it's actually the problem is not the kids are embarrassed, the problem is the parents are embarrassed. And so what Carrie H. Robinson talks about is that this is difficult knowledge. This is knowledge that uh, we as adults have trouble discussing in our own lives, much less with children. So if you are someone who has just never thought about what it means to be uh, asexual or something like that, how do you explain that to your 13-year-old kid, right? Maybe you don't feel prepared to do that. Or one of my other favorites is in Tennessee, they attempted to get rid of the book My Life by Ruby Bridges. Ruby Bridges talking about desegregating schools. And they talk about things like the pictures of white people being very angry at this cute little black girl trying to walk in to the school. And you realize that it's actually not about the kids at all. It's that there are white parents who don't know how to explain to their white children what happened during segregation and why there are all these angry white people yelling at this little girl. So, embarrassment is actually extremely important for people who are trying to ban books because it's actually like they feel their own embarrassment about it. It's not so much that the kids are embarrassed. It's really much more, I'm not prepared to be able to talk about this. Um, I don't, or I think it's immoral to talk about this. That's another issue that comes up. Um, and I absolutely do not want to talk to my kid about it. So we just don't talk about it at all.
Very that is just fascinating to me. Okay, so the way that you got your research for this book, you are a very brave person because you had to really like go and talk to people to like get this done and ask for interviews. So I guess my first question is, how did you get into the habit of like going to local meetings about book bans, and then how do you find them? Because that sounds like something you were doing and perhaps still do a lot.
Let me just say it's completely different now than it was 10 years ago. So I just wrote this in my new edition of my book. When I first started this research, I would I had um, Google alerts come to me that said that like this book was challenged, and then I would start a new alert for that book and the place. And then I would follow and see, okay, is a hearing coming? Okay, I need to get out to that hearing if I'm able to do that. I would request, I would do Freedom of Information Act requests and get the documents for it. It was actually very difficult to get to the hearings because you would find out about them a week before they happened, and I wouldn't be able to travel. Um, but I actually had a lot of luck getting the documents. Most places will send you documents. I actually have done other research on how documents are sent. The smaller places, the more likely they are to send you documents because they are less likely to have a lawyer who won't send them to you. So recently, though, post pandemic, this has become extremely difficult. Um, So I have a fire hose of Google alerts coming to me now. Um, I actually don't have to go to as many hearings because almost all of them are streamed. So it's very easy to find transcripts online. So many places moved to just putting things on YouTube. It's pretty easy to find board meetings. What I am not able to get anymore is interviews. And this is because I'm also more well known in these circles than I was before. And also because journalists have started writing about this more. I often will write someone, say, my institutional review board, we will says like approves my research. Would you talk to me? And they often say, no, I said everything I needed to, just some journalist. And I'm like, okay. So I was not able to get additional interviews for this second edition, which I'm really disappointed about. But I also give a lot of talks all over the country, and often there are people at my talks who disagree with me. And so I end up talking to them after I give my little talk and seeing what they have to say. Unfortunately, I cannot include that in my research because they have not signed the consent form, but it does help inform my analysis of the arguments that they use.
All right, so I definitely want to talk about like updates to the book, but first, so when you were doing interviews, I'm really interested by this. So, okay, you know, I didn't. I think people who don't do research that involves human input from outsiders realize, a consent form, your research is overseen. So, what is the process for actually getting a legitimate interview you can use? And then also, I guess, how do you get somebody to open up knowing, and I'm sure they know that y'all don't agree with each other?
Oh, so I did have to go through my institutional review board. They review like whether or not I'm doing legitimate research. They look at my consent form. Um, when I actually, well, it's actually pretty difficult. So what I would do is email someone because it's actually not too hard to find people's emails, or I would snail mail send them a letter, um, and include my business card in it so they can tell that I'm legit as possible. Um, Sometimes they would get back to me and they would say, I'm absolutely not talking to you. Or they would say, I'm only going to talk to you if you agree that a minor is this Webster's definition of a minor. And I would say, sure. And then they still wouldn't talk to me. When I would finally get people to actually talk to me, I found that one of the easiest things to do is let them set up how they want to talk to you. So it was usually over the phone, and I would ask them if they would run a record. And I would never start by talking about book banning. I would start by talking about books and reading and what is the book that changed their life? What is their favorite book? Did they like to go to the library? So I would do a lot of questions to build rapport. Also, most people like to talk about themselves. So once you would say, well, tell me about the challenge, a lot of them would be like, I have all these things to say about the challenge and how awful those librarians were, who didn't pay any attention to me, or how great they were to listen to what I had to say. Um, so really, it's just about listening, like active listening to the person and hearing them. Um, and then that was basically it. It was really trying to, because I was really trying to see how people felt about books, not necessarily this particular book. That was kind of secondary. Um, and people are often willing to talk about books of all sorts, and then why this book was so jarring to them when they liked books so much, usually.
That's a really interesting point because I think a lot of people who are angry about book banning, and like I know I've had this sort of uncharitable thought, right? I'll be like, oh, they haven't even read it. They're looking at one quote that makes them mad. Screw these people, like you get really upset. But one thing I really appreciated about your work was that you wanted to bring out, I guess, how much people who want to ban books usually appreciate them. So I guess how do you balance, like I do think a lot of people want to ban books because they've seen like the one page where the interesting thing was happening. But also there's like a certain respect for books Were most of the people you talk to readers? How does that tend to play out?
So it's actually both. It's not always that people are readers in the sense that like they are what I call book people, like the people on Goodreads. What they have is a lot of respect for books and the publishing process. So they have this idea that books should be true and truth should be in books. So the reason why you sometimes see people not reading the whole book is because they don't want to damage their soul by reading something that is unedifying. So what do I mean by that? If they put this image or immoral thing into their body through a book, then they are being bad, right? It's a garbage in, garbage out kind of idea. On the other hand, you have people who read the entire book who are like, I got to tell you everything that is terrible with this book. But what they all have in common is that books are incredibly important. Um, why would an author write trash? And why would a publisher publish trash? Books should never, ever have trash in them because they are books. And this is even true of people who don't read. I hope that this is like clear, when we think about like
Yeah.
the print culture that we live in, that books themselves as objects are incredibly important and revered by people.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can see it in even things like Bookstagram. You get a whole lot of like, "Oh, that celebrity got caught
Yes.
posing with a book." People got very excited about a football player on the sidelines of reading a book recently. There's
Yes.
definitely, the entire dark academia trend. There is something a little bit sexy about like being a person who is really into books, even if you're not actually doing the book part. Um,
Mhm.
so I would say that probably makes sense.
No, the reading of books is sometimes secondary for all of those trends. So I'm interested in book people in general, and especially the trend of buying special edition books, of course, especially of romantasy books, with sprayed edges and all of these things. Those aren't about really reading the books at all. Like those are just about having pretty books on your shelf, which has always been true, right? This is since books and Gutenberg started printing books, people didn't read all those books. They put them on the shelves so that they could show how wealthy they are. Books have a cultural capital of their own that continues to this day.
So this also leads me to the question of, okay, if we're worried about consuming things that aren't edifying, I so until very recently I was a high school teacher. And so I know what y'all's kids are talking about. I know what they're watching on TikTok, what they're seeing in the movies and on TV, and in video games. So, especially now that libraries carry board games, they carry video games, they carry movies. What makes what makes banning a book particularly special? And are we seeing trends to ban other things that could be on loan to match it or no?
So I really need to think about this a little bit more clearly, but I think the reason you don't see as many bans of movies, video games, and other materials is that they have an age label on them that is imposed by the publisher. And so people take those as gospel truth. So, if it's rated T for teens, then it is T for teens. And so they use this, we would call it as a heuristic device to say like, okay, then I know who can do this, can use this. Um it is possible though, because of where we are right now, that we will see more and more challenges to other types of media. I would not be surprised, simply because we're kind of in a maximalist state when it comes to challenging and banning things, and so people will try to do whatever they can. Um, but those labeling systems make it a little bit more difficult because it's easy to say, well, this is a rated R movie. You're not supposed to watch this if you're under the age of 17 without a parent anyway, you know. Um, of course, we know that these labeling systems are arbitrary. They're based on, very socially embedded ideas about what is good or not good. Um, the MPAA is based on, a handful of people saying that something is rated R versus PG-13. Um, would you agree with those standards or not as a parent? Who knows? Um, these sorts of things, but it's an easy device, right? I'm not saying that in a bad way. I'm just saying that, like, well, my kid is 7 years old. I probably don't want them watching a PG-13 movie. It's harder to do that with books because you get a general age for the books, but how people interact with books is quite different than how they interact with other types of mediums.
Yeah, actually, this leads me around to one of the other really interesting sort of aspects of the book that is very religious studies informed, which is
Mm-hmm.
the way that you experience a book is somehow perceived as more maybe deep because it is so seemingly private. So I
Yes.
remember reading references, about monasteries, right? Like, oh, everybody used to read everything aloud, and you got to worry about the person who reads silently because who knows what's going on over there. Um, so is this
Yes.
still like? I mean,
Yes.
it's amazing to see that tradition carrying forward.
Absolutely. This is actually where I start a lot of my talks, which is to talk about how the monks read in the refectory. Someone would read out to everybody. And the key there is that someone can interrupt and say, and this is how you should think about this. And this is what we mean by this. And you know where someone is in a book. Um, when we think about reading today, you don't even know what someone's reading if they're reading on their Kindle, right? That is a completely, and I like that you said seemingly private because it actually isn't that private, right? Reading is a social practice that we engage in, but it is you interacting with this text in ways that other people may not be able to see. Um, Reading is a somewhat mysterious practice of how it works, like what is happening when we engage with text on a page. Um, and the way to really think about this is to think about the graphic narrative because we don't know what to do with these books that have come out. So, what is a graphic narrative? Is it literature? How do you engage with both the images and text on a page? It's not just like reading a picture book, it's a little bit different. But think about, the way you engage with text being like read to you on an audiobook, reading it with your eyes, seeing images on a text. These are very difficult things to talk about. But we do feel them strongly. Um, I ask my students, think about the book that changed your life. I don't know what book that is, but I am sure all of you can think of some book that changed your life. And what do you mean by that? And how is a book able to do that? There's something about how we engage with text that's on a somewhat different plane than how we engage with other mediums.
I don't. So if you have thoughts on this, I want to hear them, which is why I'm bringing this up. But I also find it very interesting that I think we're seeing a rise in book bans at the same time as we're seeing a couple of other like interesting trends. So one is the ability to self-publish, especially to Kindle. And everybody laughs a little bit about having a Kindle Unlimited subscription because a lot of that is romantasy. Let's just go with that. It's spicy, as it were. We're seeing a
Smut.
rise in
It's
discussion
smut.
of spicy literature. It is.
Hmm.
And like pride in reading this among especially women on book talk, and like of course there's also the subgenre of like men who read it and they're like, wow, I understand my wife so much better.
Hmm.
And then we're also seeing sort of paradoxically We talked about reading as like a private activity versus not, sort of the sanitization of physical book covers where it's no longer entirely clear who something's being marketed for. Like I remember we talked a lot in the past year online about hockey romances that looked like you could buy it for a middle schooler, but there's some scenes in there. How are all these trends, do you think, how are they connected to what I would say is an increasingly aggressive environment around book banning in schools?
This is a great question, and you're making me realize that I need to look at this and research a little bit more. I think what we're seeing, based on how you asked that, is we're going back to when pulp fiction became a thing again, the dime store novels, which people hated. you know, we can read about like people reading this trash that they only cost them a dime at the drugstore. um, we are going we are seeing that happen again. I really need to look at that time period. I'm mostly familiar with it when comics, the comics code and that kind of thing came in, but the dime store novel, that's essentially what we're seeing on things like Kindle Unlimited. And those, I actually have my students do a semiotic reading of book covers so they can tell me who the book is for based on the design of the cover. And almost all of those things are intentional, right? To um, There's long been uh, a trend in women's fiction to cover up the spiciness of what is inside. So most libraries don't collect what they call erotica. And if you actually go to a library and look at the romance section, there's actually tons of erotica on the shelf. It What they actually mean is they don't collect like really trashy erotica, urban fiction erotica, the kind that just gets sold in all sorts of places. But if you actually read some of the books, the spiciness level is off the charts, but you can't tell because there's nothing on the cover to make it look like it may be a little bit spicy. Um, so I think this has a long been a trend in what I'll just call women's fiction, um, that we have seen probably since women's fiction was a thing, which is that things are often disguised by the cover. And what the true evolution, I just have to say, with things like e readers is that genre fiction just exploded because no one will make fun of you for reading whatever cozy mystery romance with cats that you want to read because they can't see the cover if you're reading it on Kindle. And this has made a huge difference in people's reading, uh, how they read and what they read.
Oh man, like this is actually such an interesting topic, but I want to bring it back around specifically when we talk about banning. It's hard to tell like who something's for. It's if you have unlimited access to your Kindle or to an e-reader, nobody knows what it is you're reading. Would the one thing I've seen pitched a couple times now is like, oh well, books should just have a rating system like movies, and then it would be fine, and you would just know what books you're allowed to have. Is that like something that anybody is seriously considering? And like, would that ever even work? I can't imagine that actually working for books because I feel like as a kid I read all kinds of stuff that first of all did no harm to me. I'm a much better person for everything I read. But also I think that I don't know, I feel like books are probably the safest place to be exposed to material that's going to challenge you a little bit. And how do you decide like when somebody's ready or not for some of those things?
I think my question would be: does the rating system for movies actually work? We act as if it works, but I don't know that it actually does. I encourage everyone to watch the movie, the documentary. This movie is not yet rated. It's You can get it through Canopy. I think it's still freely available online. This really looks into the MPA ratings board, But some things to know about movie ratings is that they are very, very sexist. So, if, for example, a woman is shown having sexual pleasure in a movie, it will be much more likely to get an NC-17 or rated R rating than if a man is having sexual pleasure in a movie. Um, how they rate violence, I think, is inscrutable. Like how they understand violence, because violence is male coded in many ways, and so like lots of violence. They talk about things like blood and that sort of thing, but it's very arbitrary. You have to realize how arbitrary these ratings are. Thinking about it with books, I just don't know that it will ever work the way people want it to. Um, Classification is an imposition on your own interpretation of a text, because you're in many ways told this is what this is going to be, right? This is what this is. Um, and libraries have to do this because it's part of making things accessible as well. But I encourage people to think about, you're still imposing these categories on things. And categories are real. So if you go to a bookstore, and it has, say, a black section, right? How many non-black people do you see there? How many men do you see in the romance section? Um, these are actually restrictions imposed by the categories themselves, and they are problematic. Diana Gabaldon, who wrote Outlander, insists that her book is not a romance. And I still go places and I see it in the romance section. Um, and why did she say that? Because romance is for women. And so when you think about it that way, you realize how actually categorization is so tightly enmeshed with censorship, because what people are actually saying is like, this is this type of knowledge, this is this type of thing, and it is not for these other people. So these are all kind of wrapped up with each other. And that's why rating systems are a problem. It's not that people shouldn't know necessarily what they're getting into. I don't read horror. I'm glad that, like, I can find out something about what horror is, but, is horror the same as a little spooky? Who's making that decision? I would like to make that decision for myself, and I can always put a book down if I want to.
That is very true. So just before I ask and then down the next, vein of questions, I feel like we're also having a cultural conversation about things like trigger or content warnings
Hmm.
and how those should be deployed. I actually generally appreciate them because sometimes I don't want to like. I mean, if I'm looking up a romance novel to read, I don't really like romances that have a cheating trope or love
Mm.
triangle. So I actually like knowing a little bit about things going in because I know if I don't want to read it. But do you see changes in, I guess, content warnings happening? And is that at all a solution to the problem, or are the same people who are banning books also the people who are like, well, why are there content warnings on things?
Yes, they are. This is the thing, is that these are communication devices. I actually have a book that I edited on trigger warnings. Um, so the thing about all of these types of warnings and labels is that they are embedded in speech communities. And so, yes, there are certain types of content warnings that are used by a certain community online, but that does not mean that they translate for other people. My other worry about things like trigger and content warnings is that inevitably, people who are more marginalized will end up with their works having these warnings on them. We saw that happen in music. What gets the parental ratings? Hip hop. That's not a mistake. It
Right.
is because people who are marginalized often have more trauma in their lives and people who are less marginalized. Um, so once again, this becomes an issue of power and dominance that always needs to be thought about carefully.
Interesting. Okay, so we've talked a lot about work that you've done to date. We know that you've got another edition of this book coming. So the first edition of Book Banning in 21st Century America was published in 2015. Is now 2025. We're on a roller coaster ride in terms of what is considered okay for kids in schools. Woo! Um, what is your update looking like so far, and what like aspects of your work have you chosen to target for the most updating?
That's a great question. So, what on it? Let me address this a couple of different ways. So, one thing I did is I put a new chapter in the book that is about a public hearing that I went to in Metropolis, Illinois, home of the world's largest Superman statue, down by Kentucky in southern Illinois. If you're ever driving down there, I recommend checking it out. It's pretty cool. They had a whole thing happen at their library, and I was able to go to that hearing. So I have a whole chapter on that, and it was amazing. There was cussing at the hearing, people yelling at each other. I know this is sad, but that makes my day. Like, what could be better than people getting excited at a hearing at a library? Um, I also expanded all of my examples. So if new things came up, I would put those in there. I talk a bit more about things like diverse books and critical race theory, intersectionality. But quite honestly, the reasons people give for banning books have not changed over 500 years. Um, it is pretty much the same. Books are really important. Reading can change your life. Um, I don't like what this talks about. How do I make sure that my kids don't end up being bad or like not having my values? How can I make sure that my soul will be fine as I go forward? Um, these reasons just have not changed. It is really book banning is about reading. It is about reading and books. And there are only so many reasons you can give for like reading and books. So, what I actually found was that people are making very similar arguments. Sometimes the context is a little bit different. Um, we're seeing more of calling people groomers and pedophiles, but these are actually arguments that started in the late 19th century and have come forward again. They are not necessarily new arguments to be made. Um, so the book is longer, and I tried to find updated examples, and I had way too much to choose from. And so I really had to limit what I could look at because otherwise I would have been really overwhelmed.
Yeah, we mentioned this a bit in this conversation previously, but your research methods have also had to change a bit because of all that overwhelm. So it sounds like you have, in some ways, access to more information, via streaming. In some ways, less access to information because you can't get interviews anymore. How are you sifting through and deciding what is important? Because I feel like you might be getting a lot more data than you would have in 2015.
Oh gosh. So honestly, I could not look at everything I had. So I actually have two huge cases. So one is at St. Tammany's Public Library in Covington, Illinois. I mean, sorry, Covington, Louisiana. Oh, that's awful. St. Tammany's Parish. I'm sorry. That's Louisiana. Um, I think they had 200 or 300 requests. Samuel's Public Library in Front Royal, Virginia had about that many, plus an entire nonprofit organization that's against them. I could only use some of that information. It is still sitting on my computer because I actually could do case studies on these. These are full blown case studies. My advisee is working on the McMinn County mouse um, banning that happened in the public schools there. You just have to let things go. Actually still have data I haven't used from my dissertation. Honestly, it's just so much that I just can't worry about it in many ways. Like this is work that could go on forever. I actually also have my former colleague, Christine Jenkins. I have her box of research from the Satanic Panic in the 1980s. I have not been able to look through that either.
Whoa,
Yeah. Yeah.
that sounds
So
cool.
it is just so much work. Um, and I just look through what I can. And I'm looking for exemplars, and I can find those pretty quickly. It's pretty clear what someone's going to say in about 2 seconds, you know. And sometimes they write very big on the actual form, so I just transcribe that and put it in my book, and I'm done. You know, this person is once again talking about how all these books should be removed and you should never buy another one again. So that's pretty easy to say.
All right, so you know a lot about this process of book banning, fighting about books, and what it does in communities. If you are a person who really, really cares about this issue, um, how do you get involved in these conversations about book bannings? How do you play a role, especially if you're not a parent?
Oh, so get a public library card. Stay aware of what is happening in your local community. So I do encourage people to run for board if you support access to information for all. Show up at the board meetings, anything that might happen. Um, Read these books. So, not necessarily the ones that are at the top of the list, but the mid list books need support. Encourage your library to buy them, give them as gifts for friends. Um, there's so many things to do. Join organizations like Unite Against Book Bans. That's a national one. Actually, I'm chair of the board of the National Coalition Against Censorship. I'm a former president of the Freedom to Read Foundation. These are organizations you can join. But the main thing is to be vigilant in your local community, because the the phenomenon of outsiders coming in is a real phenomenon for these, and it is not effective. What your um, mayor, your library director, the board wants to hear is to say, I live right here in town, and this is how I feel about this. Um, these are hyper local events, even though they are going across the country. Um, they really are about what is happening in your own community, and just where we are with our administration. Um, there's actually not much that a lot of us can do on the federal level. Get in touch with your Congress people, call them, that sort of thing. But where you actually make a difference is to get involved locally, vote in local elections. Um, those are coming up this year. Apparently, my my town will have a mayor. I see signs around. I need to learn more about these people. Support League of Women Voters when they do their nonpartisan debates. These things are all really important, and you can really make a difference by showing up. I mean, showing up makes a huge, you don't even have to say anything, but just be there, let people know, I think that my public institutions are good, and that we should support them and the people who work in them.
Fantastic. I feel like it's a good place to leave off this series interview, but I will ask you my softy questions that I always ask at the end. So normally I ask
Okay.
people about a game they've been playing that they've really been enjoying. But I feel like in the spirit of this conversation, you can recommend a game too if you want. But what is a
Okay.
book that you think people listening to this should go and read?
Oh gosh.
Maybe
Uh
just for fun.
so
Like,
let me actually talk about games first. So we have play a lot of games. Um we were just playing Descent, which is kind of intense, but it is so awesome because you get to build up the game board, and it is 3D, and so that is really fun. Um, I'm trying not to buy too many board games right now. We have lots to play, but I actually just bought Star Realms. So I am a Star Realms completist, and I have their new legacy game, and I haven't opened it yet, but I probably will soon. I'm a big fan of deck builders in general. Um, so let's see, a book that I recommend people read. Um, wow, that's such a good question. Um, So it's kind of an old school book. So I'll recommend an old school book, which is "Reading Becomes a Necessity of Life" by Gilmore. If you're into academics and thinking about reading, this is one of the best that I've read. Um, I'd say like a book to read for fun. Gosh, it's so hard. I'm just gonna mention my favorite author, who is Tamara Pierce, and I'm gonna say how
oh
much
yes.
I love her Tortal books and her Circle of Magic books. Um, she really got me into fantasy, and I've been reading many more like lighter fantasy, and also you mentioned people who've been publishing more. I've been reading a lot of books by just authors who publish 3 books a year, these cozy mysteries. One is Benedict Brown, and another is CJ Archer. And um, I think I'll leave it there. I think I'll leave it there. I've been trying to go through all the books that I've been reading recently, and I've mostly been reading really fun books because it's been so hard. Um, I like to read to escape, and I listen to a lot of audiobooks while I'm playing Slay the Sapphire on video game. So that's one of my favorite things to do before I go to bed.
Oh, that's a good combo. I gotta try that now. And then if people want to follow your work online, they want to track your work, they want to see what you're up to, where can you be found?
So I'm EJM Knox, KNOX, at on Blue Sky. I don't post much, but I probably will start posting more. And my website is Emily Knox at .net. So all my information is there if you want to find out more about me.
Perfect. Emily, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed this
Oh,
conversation and I really appreciate getting to have it now.
yeah. Thank you so much. This was great.
All right, everybody. I can be found anywhere online as Beyond Solitaire. I am terminally online, so I will see you somewhere. But until then, please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming and reading.